Welcome, investigator. Evil is on the rise. Crime is escalating. Our mission is to eliminate the crime by exposing evil, examine why it manifests, and highlight the brave souls that confront it every day. Join us as we work together to bring justice to every victim. Welcome to All Things Crime. Here's your host, Jared Bradley.
Hey everybody, it's Jared. Welcome to another episode of All Things Crime. We are excited to have you on this morning and appreciate you following us. Make sure to hit subscribe and hit like and even write us a little comment on there. That would be awesome. I appreciate you listening. And I am super excited this morning to have a district attorney from Sacramento. His name is Thien Ho. And man, it's there's so much we want to talk about, but one of the coolest things about not only being a DA, but also he's wrote a book. So, Mr. Ho, I appreciate you coming on. And you know what? I'll let you introduce yourself because I know that I'll butcher it, and the audience would probably appreciate it hearing it from you a little better anyway.
Sure. So my name is Thien Ho. I am the elected district attorney of Sacramento County. I've been in that position for 3 years, but before that, I've been a prosecutor for almost 25 years now. And so I wrote a book called The People versus the Golden State Killer. It's getting released on November the 11th of 2025. And it's sort of what I call the end of a trilogy. So Michelle McNamara wrote her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, about the Golden State Killer. Unfortunately, she passed away before we caught him. Once we caught him, Paul Hose, my colleague, who was an investigator on the case and came up with the idea of using investigative genetic genealogy to solve the case, wrote a book. But it was about the investigation and how he was caught. Well, once we caught him and we started prosecuting him, I was the lead prosecutor out of 6 different counties that sent prosecutors. And so I have written a book called The People versus the Golden State Killer. It's the end of the trilogy. It covers both the investigation, the capture, and the prosecution of the Golden State Killer.
Wow. Can people, I want to get a copy of this, of all the cases that have been solved, and especially for those of you that have followed this show, we talk about investigative genealogy all the time. And I've met Paul, especially at, I don't know, have you ever gone to CrimeCon, Tim?
You know, I was going to go to CrimeCon this year in September, but my plan is I'm going to be going to CrimeCon in Vegas next year in May. So I'm definitely going to be there. In fact, I was talking to Paul beforehand. And so, in fact, he has reviewed the book. And he gave it a raving review as well. And you can get the book and pre-order it ahead of time, and it should come before the release date. But you can order the book on thienho.org. That's THIENHO.org. It will send you to a link where you can buy the book from a local bookstore, because we need to support our local bookstores. But I'd love to talk to you about the book, because there are things that I reveal that has never been revealed before about the Golden State Killer in terms of the investigation, the capture, and the prosecution.
Oh, absolutely. So, yeah, I wanted to get that out of the way so that now we can get into the nitty gritty of it. I am so excited about it. So, as far as the Golden State Killer, I think a lot of people know about the amazing number of crimes that he committed, not just murders, but and then I think most people know about the investigative genealogy that kind of broke the case, but it's exciting for you to come on and talk about what. So once the okay, so answer this. When did you really start becoming involved? And because I know the prosecution has to come in and talk extensively with the investigators to say, this is what I need in order to put together a case.
Mm-hmm. So, sort of the genesis of the case, I mean, it's been going on 40 years. He committed 13 known murders, upwards of 50 sexual assault, over 120 burglaries in 11 different counties. So you can imagine, you know, the 1970s and 1980s, the investigation that went into it, but everybody was siloed. And the investigation continued and continued and continued until 2018, we actually located and found him. And once we did, that prosecution process started where and a person is arraigned in court, meaning they go to court for the very first time, and they're told what the charges are, and the process begins. And so soon after that arraignment, I was brought in to oversee the prosecution of the entire case, which dealt with, for example, collecting all the evidence, all the discovery from the 11 different counties, whether they be police reports, whether they be lab reports, whether they be interviews of thousands of suspects, right? And then also all the forensic evidence in terms of how we found them, you know, and then try to recreate that and move forward in terms of prosecuting him. You know, and one of the interesting things that I talk about in the book that has never been discussed before is his interrogation. It's been hinted about. It's you know, I foreshadowed it a little bit when I was in court on it. But soon after he was arrested by what we call the body snatchers. So there's a group of deputy sheriffs, and they're part of an elite team. And their job is to go find people and then to arrest them based upon arrest warrants, fugitive warrants. And their nickname is the Body Snatchers. When you look at them, they're sort of a motley crew. They get to wear beards, they got tattoos, you know, they wear cargo pants and hats and try to blend in with everybody else, you know, and they're big guys. And so their job is to go find people, to snatch them up and to bring them to justice. And so once we located him, it was the job of the Body Snatchers to go out and arrest him. And so I detail like a play-by-play of how his arrest went down by the Body Snatchers. And then he was taken into an interview room. And I go through play-by-play the interrogation, what he said in that interrogation. And one of the keys about an interrogation, it's almost as if it's like a dance. And you have to almost have a partner to dance with, but you have to massage in a certain way and move together with a certain rhythm, because you want them to talk. You want them to give up information. You want them to admit things and talk about things. And so there's a delicate process. And his interview was unique. One of the most unique interrogation I've ever seen, because once they put him in the room, and we can talk about this more, he just sat there and said nothing for the longest time. They even offered him Dr. Pepper, and he refused. Jared, are you familiar with the Golden State Killer's connection with Dr. Pepper?
Oh, I'm not. No. What is that?
So at a number of the crime scenes of the East Area Rapist, so the Golden State Killer is known by many different monikers, right? He's been known as the East Area Rapist, the East Bay Rapist, the Visalia Ransacker, the original Night Stalker, and the Golden State Killer. So when he was committing his rapes in Sacramento, he would drink people's beer. But one thing that he loved to drink and he would leave behind were cans of Dr. Pepper. He loved Dr. Pepper. And so when we arrested Joseph DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, what did we find inside his house? Cases upon cases of Dr. Pepper. So we're now in the interrogation room, right? And the detective, Kenny Clark, the lead detective, kept offering, hey, you know, Joe, do you want some Dr. Pepper? We have Dr. Pepper, even brought it in for him. And he would just sit there and say nothing, no reaction. And when the detectives left the room, you could see him kind of licking his lips, right? You could tell that he was thirsty because he hadn't drank anything for like 3 hours from the point where we arrested him to where we initiated the interrogation. We let him sit there for a while. That's an interrogation technique, so that they just kind of stew in their own juices. And so we put Dr. Pepper out for him. And we knew he was thirsty. We knew he wanted to drink it. And we offered him the Dr. Pepper, but he wouldn't take it. And in his mind, he was afraid that we were going to collect his DNA after he drank that Dr. Pepper. But what he didn't know, what he didn't realize, was we already collected his DNA outside his house from a trash run about a week before that, where we had a detective dressed up as a garbage guy. We took a plastic, we lined it inside of a garbage truck, drove up, picked up the garbage, dumped it in, and then we found a piece of tissue, the last thing we tested. And we tested that, and that's what connected him to all the rapes and all the murders that we had DNA left on.
Oh, that's so interesting. I'm not sure that's what Dr. Pepper wants to be known for, but it's interesting when you talk about different interrogation techniques. There's a whole, I think you nailed it. There's a whole art to it. And the important thing is getting them to feel comfortable enough that they'll actually start talking. So it's fascinating. So
And can I follow up on that, Jared, real
Yeah,
quick?
please,
The
please.
interrogation. So we put him inside the interrogation room, and he sits there for the longest time. He's not talking. So finally, one of the techniques that we have is they start coming at him like, I'm sure you're curious as to why you're here, right? Because when they're arrested, especially after 40 years, the number one thing they're thinking in their mind is, why have I been arrested? What charges am I looking at? And most importantly, what evidence do they have? Right. And
Mm-hmm.
so, right in the beginning of the interrogation, and I do a play by play in the book, they teased him a little bit with why he was arrested. And they asked him, hey, if you want to hear why you're arrested, let us know. And then they have to read him his Miranda rights, right? And then, so there's a whole song and dance about his Miranda rights, his right to remain silent in that interrogation that I talk about. But at one point, they confronted him with the murders of Brian and Katie Maggiore in Sacramento. They confronted him with the rapes in Sacramento. They confronted him with the murder and rape of Charlene Smith and Lyman Smith down in Ventura. And so that was the whole dramatic scene behind there. And at first, he doesn't say anything. But the key part is when the detectives left the room and he was sitting there by himself, what it was he was saying. And so it was really intriguing. And he started teasing what I would call setting up a mental defense. And I talk about this in the book. And the mental defense was what we call dissociative identity disorder or split personality disorder. And so we detail the whole kind of what he said about that in the book and how we try to counter that to beat that alleged defense he was setting up.
Oh, it's fascinating. So a couple questions. One is what do you think is the primary evidence that you had that generated the warrant for you to actually go and get him and pick him up?
DNA. Really, the primary evidence is DNA. You have to understand that, the way society viewed sexual assault in the 1970s is different than now. The statute of limitation back then was only 3 years. And so the problem was a lot of the sexual assaults in Sacramento, in the Bay Area, the DNA was all thrown away, except for several cases in Contra Costa where Paul Holes worked. And the DNA was tested there. They had a profile, a suspect. And then there were the rapes and the murders down in Ventura, Santa Barbara, and Orange County. And those were all connected by DNA. And then back in 2001, the Southern California crimes were connected to the Contra Costa crimes by DNA. And then the Contra Costa crimes were connected to the Sacramento crimes by MO. And for your viewers who are not familiar with the MO of the East Area Rapist or the Golden State Killer, he would break into the home at 1 o'clock in the morning, shine a flashlight on the husband and wife. He would force the wife to tie up the husband with pre-tied shoelaces that he brought with him. Then he'd tie up the wife. Then he would walk around the house, eating their food, drinking their beer, drinking their Dr. Pepper. And then he'd come back and using a ruse, remove the wife into another room looking for a purse. He'd come back, tie up the husband again, make the husband get on all fours and put a bed sheet on him. He stacked perfume bottles and glasses on the husband and say, if I hear anything fall, I'll cut your son's ear off and bring it to you. I'll kill everybody in the family. Then he'd go in the other room and sexually assault the wife again and again. And before he would leave, he would take the wedding band. He would take one earring but leave the other behind to remind him of what he had taken and what was left. And so that was tied together. So the primary evidence that connected him for the arrest warrant was the DNA evidence and the MO.
Oh, it's absolutely fascinating. Describe really quickly I don't, most people I don't think have been in an interrogation room, but the ones that I've actually been in,
And that's a
uh,
good thing.
yeah, not as a suspect of anything, but just sitting in one. It has all of this, sound stuff that it's definitely silent, and I'm assuming that most interrogation rooms are like that, and so literally you can hear your own heartbeat, and I'm assuming that's part of the interrogation, correct?
Absolutely. So this interrogation room, you have a metal door that just clangs really loud when it opens and closes. And inside, it's like beige wall, and it's four walls, and there's no windows in it. There's a metal table. There's some plastic chairs that are in there. There's a metal loop where the suspect is handcuffed to, so they can't escape. And the room is literally bathed in that government fluorescent light color that just makes everything antiseptic. There's nothing alive in that room. But the room, the interrogation room, it sees everything, it hears everything, it knows everything, it never forgets anything because there's a recording device inside that room. And that's the place that we put DeAngelo. And he comes in after his arrest. This seems like a chubby old grandfather or an uncle. He's wearing a white t-shirt, cargo shorts, and shoes with two socks. And here he is, the boogeyman of so many people's nightmares and childhood, sitting inside this interrogation room, and everything that is about to then happen to him. And we set it up in a way where we try to make him think, make him really stew, and kind of isolate him before we get in there.
Yeah. So the psychology of that is fascinating by itself. But once he gets into that room, how long did you let him stew?
We let him stew for nearly almost an hour and 45 minutes.
Okay, that's a
So a
long
good
time to just be in a room where your thoughts are probably as loud in your head as your heartbeat is. Um, well, that's awesome. And then, so who actually did the interrogation?
So the interrogation was done really by a team of detectives. So the first was Sergeant Kenny Clark. He was the lead detective from the Sacramento Sheriff's Department. He had a near encyclopedic memory of the entire case, not just in Sacramento, but up and down the state. There was also Detective Michelle Hendricks of the sexual assault team. And then what was interesting and added some flavor to this was an investigator from the Ventura County District Attorney's Office, Steve Rose. And Kenny Clark has what I call the radio voice, right? And Steve Rose is this thin, wiry, leathery cop with this deep, gravelly voice. And of course, we played the good cop, bad cop. Kenny Clark was the good cop, and Investigator Rose was the bad cop. And they sort of played off each other to try to get him to go at it. And one point, at the end of the interrogation, Investigator Rose, and I sort of describe him there, walks up to him, the investigator puts his hand on DeAngelo's shoulder and says, "I know you did it." And so, there's a whole kind of play with that. And from the interrogation, we then moved on to the prosecution of the case. And one of the things, as we're going through the prosecution, we have to really retrace every single step of DeAngelo's life. Try to fill in all the blanks from the moment he was born in Bath, New York, to the moment he, was arrested in Citrus Heights outside in front of his house wearing those cargo shorts and the white T-shirt. Interviewing his family, interviewing his ex-wife, his kids, interviewing his former brother-in-law, interviewing his friends, his former co-workers, everybody in his family that's still alive, to really dig into and find out and get a picture of the monster behind the mask. And there were things that we found out about his childhood, particularly his adolescence. He was already in his adolescence, and this isn't out publicly yet, but he was breaking into homes, stealing things, just knickknacks and little things of sentimental values for people, and he was learning how to do it using a screwdriver or a butter knife, and he became almost an expert in it, in how he did it. And we found out about that because one of the other teenagers that he befriended, the two of them started breaking into homes. In the book, I talk about an incident where they broke into a home in Rancho Cordova, only about less than a mile away from where he committed his first rape. And DeAngelo was only a teenager at the time. So he sneaks into the garage, and the door was open. So the two of them come into the garage. As they step foot into the garage, there's a German Shepherd that comes running out from the garage, barking, right? That's what German Shepherds do. They protect their home. And DeAngelo kind of, stumbled backwards, fell down, and hurt his wrist. And he was so angry that he wanted to hurt the dog. And he says, "I'm going to get that dog. I'm going to get that dog." And his co-conspirator, his partner in crime, who was also a teenager, said, "Look, that dog's just doing what he's supposed to do. Don't hurt the dog." But DeAngelo was so angry that he pulled out an M80 firecracker, lit it, threw it into the garage, and it blew up underneath the dog, and the dog caught on fire and died. And if you know about some of his crimes as the East Area rapist, as the Golden State Killer, he hated dogs, in particular German Shepherds, those big guard dogs. And I think that we can trace it back to this particular incident and what happened to him. But, we hear about serial killers all the time, abusing animals. And DeAngelo was no different than all those serial killers. He abused animals, even at a young age. And I talk about some of that and some of the other facts that have not been released about DeAngelo in the book.
So did any of his family actually know that he was abusing animals?
I think his family had an idea that he perhaps was abusing animal, but he was able to compartmentalize it. I think ultimately, and I get asked this question, did his wife or his ex-wife know that he was a serial killer or a rapist? And I could honestly say that I don't believe that they knew. Him and his ex-wife, they lived completely separate lives. Even when they lived in the same home, they slept in separate rooms. They had different schedules. His wife was going to law school, and he was a police officer. And then he got fired from his job as a police officer stealing dog repellent, right? And so when he got fired from his job, he was just unmoored, unanchored, just floating about. And so he had his own schedule. He was able to move up and down the state in different areas and commit his crime. And I think his wife was so focused on herself that she didn't realize that she was living with a serial killer and a serial rapist.
Yeah, that's crazy. I know for most people that's probably really difficult to even comprehend that you wouldn't be involved with somebody that you're actually married to, but I guess it's possible, and obviously it is because that's what happened. But
and I think there's some interesting points in that, Jared.
Yeah.
Is number one, they were together for a certain period of time, and then they separated. And then she didn't go through with the divorce, the ex-wife Sharon, until he was finally arrested on the charges of being a serial killer. So for 20-something years, they lived in different homes. But during the period of time when they were living together, he was committing his rapes. I don't think she was aware of it. And truth be honest, I don't think she was aware of it because she was so self-centered and self-focused on herself and on her own career and her own life that they essentially were roommates and lived separate lives. And so I don't think she knew because of that. The nature of her personality in terms of being self-centered and the nature of the relationship. But I know it's hard to believe that. But we did find something in a search of his house that is very interesting. We went back into his house about a year later to search for trophies. And we found some stuff in his house. And we believe that it was owned by his daughter. And it was just very, I don't know what word to describe, whether it's ironic or whether it's, maybe your intuition. But we found books inside the house, and she was a psychology major. And her focus as a psychology major. Her interest, do you know what that was?
Criminal psychology.
Serial killers.
Oh, geez. Okay. Yeah, boy, the irony on that is pretty thick.
Yes.
Um, has she ever said anything about, uh, that connection?
We found that out after we interviewed her. I think she was just a psychology major who happened to have an interest in, of all things, serial killer. And here it is. Her dad is one of the most notorious serial killers in the history of California and the country.
Yeah. Wow. Boy, that's amazing. I haven't ever heard that one. So
And so,
yeah, I guess
and,
I
and in
guess
the book,
that's why we do this, right?
yes, and in the book, I talk about what happened when we went back into the house a year later to search for trophies, to search for all of that.
Interesting. So is she still did she graduate? Is she a clinical psychologist now?
I believe she is, but I really didn't follow up. And one of the things I put in the book is I believe honestly that his wife and his daughters are victims as much as anybody else. That they did not create this monster. They did not know that they were living with a monster. And they are, in a different sense, not like in the traditional sense, in a different sense, also victims of him. And so I also, in the book, I don't name them. I don't provide their names because I do want to recognize and protect a little bit of their privacy, because you don't control who it is that, that is your father, right? Or your mother. That's not a choice that you have. That's just something that happens to the forces of the universe. And so that
Of
places you there.
course.
So I don't think that that's fair to them.
Oh, I absolutely. I wouldn't want to expose them at all, but it's just interesting that they, well, actually, as you were describing that, I was thinking, the most prolific serial killers and rapists or whatever, these monsters, literally, I think the more skilled they are at hiding themselves and like living that separate, the duality of the
Mm-hmm.
killer life plus the normal life that they try to portray to everybody, to as appearing as normal as they can. The more skilled they are at that, the more they're able to feed their killer instinct, I guess, of their serial killer. But would you agree with that? Is that kind of what your experience shows?
I do, and he was the master manipulator. Um, he wore a mask when he committed his crimes, but the fact that he was a police officer during the Visalia ransacking series, the East Air Rapist series, the badge and uniform was a mask. His family was a mask. The fact that he was a mechanic living in a quiet suburb was a mask, and he was the master manipulator. And if you notice, when he came to court, his first court appearance, his arraignment, he was in a wheelchair, acting, with his head back, acting as he was an invalid. And as the case went on, every single time in court, he would just sit there, mouth agape like a fish breathing out of water, looking as if he was incoherent. But I had videos of him in his jail cell, climbing up and down, walking around, doing sexual things as well, which I detail in the book, inside his jail cell. And so at the age of 72 and 73. And so when you look at that, whatever he was doing in court was just a continuation of that manipulation. He was really, really good at it. He was so meticulous in committing his crimes and compartmentalizing his life. During the day, he was a police officer, and at night he is out there stalking his prey, his human prey, like he's stalking an elk or a deer to take down. He would break into people's homes and leave an item in the seat cushion and come back days later to see if they found it. He would take something in the house and come back to see if it had been moved around and if it had been noticed or not. He was so meticulous in how he was committing his crimes. But what he didn't realize, at least while he was committing his crime, and he couldn't have, was that we would develop a technology that would allow us to identify him, find him, and bring him to justice.
Yeah, yeah. Back in the 60s and 70s, and even most of the 80s, DNA wasn't even considered back then. So I think as long as he thought he wasn't leaving solid fingerprints everywhere, he was probably safe. Yeah, I've talked to others that they said he even used his position as a police officer to do, like, he was scouting during the day and actually looking at some of the victims and finding their patterns and doing a lot of his I wouldn't call it investigative work, but for him it kind of was, and he used his position as a police officer to do that.
Absolutely. And not only that, he used his knowledge as a law enforcement officer to escape capture. One of the things I start off the book, and the book is essentially has like three different stories running through it, right? One of the stories is, the investigation, the capture, and the prosecution of the case. Another story is, my work in terms of prosecuting the case. And the third story that runs through the book is I follow a couple of the victims, what happened to them, during their crime and after their crime, and how they found their voice after we prosecute them. So what I try to do is, move the focus away from the crime and the criminal and focus it on the pursuit, the unending pursuit by law enforcement and the resiliency of the survivors. And in the process of doing that, I talk about, how he used his background in law enforcement to avoid capture. But the law enforcement community, generations of law enforcement, never gave up. We always suspected that he was a former cop, and we were right. We always suspected that he was former military, and we were right. And so the profile that was developed of him was pretty much dead on every step of the way. It was just a matter of finding him, identifying him in the list of tens of thousands of people.
So how did the vetting process for both the military and the law enforcement miss this? I mean, so he was so good at manipulating that he could even manipulate those vetting processes.
Well, you got to remember, first of all, he served in Vietnam. And so during then, we needed people to go to fight in Vietnam. And he wasn't, he was on a U.S. Navy ship in Vietnam, several different ships. And then in terms of when he got out, he got his degree in criminology, or his degree, in public safety to become a police officer. And you have to remember, this is the 1970s. We don't have the profiling, we don't have the screening process that we do today in terms of background checks and profiling, and applicants and running them. This was the 1970s. And so we have to really kind of put it in perspective. And so my book, what it does is it covers one period of time from 1974 to 1986 when he committed his crimes. And then it covers another period of time from 2018 to 2020 when we found him, we brought him to court, and we brought him to justice. So it covers, the investigation, the capture, and the prosecution.
So other than the mountain of evidence, what kind of difficulties did you have actually putting the case together to make sure that it was just rock solid?
The interesting thing is, so remember, he committed 50 rapes in Sacramento, 120 burglaries in Visalia. And when he committed the 120 burglaries in Visalia, he, in the process, tried to kidnap a 15-year-old girl, Beth Snelling. A 16-year-old girl, Beth Snelling. And her father, Professor Claude Snelling, came out to intercept and stop it, and he was shot and killed. And then you had the attempted murder of Officer Bill McGowan from the Visalia Police Department that we prosecuted as well. And so you have that series that didn't have DNA evidence. And then you had the Sacramento rapes and the two Sacramento murders of Brian and Katie Majori that no longer had DNA evidence because, the evidence was tossed when the statute of limitation had run. Now, you had a series of rapes in the Bay Area, but only 3 of them had DNA evidence in Contra Costa. And then all the murders and rapes in Southern California had DNA evidence. So those cases were solid. But all his cases in Sacramento and most of them in the Bay Area had no DNA evidence. And so we had to tie them to modus operandi, including the 2 murders in Sacramento. So the challenging part is trying to prove the case when you don't have any DNA evidence and the other counties do. And so I was tasked with prosecuting the cases that had no DNA evidence. And that was the true challenge, because now you had to do it by way of circumstantial evidence. You had to do it by modus operandi and a means, a motive, an opportunity to do so. And that's where the skill comes from in terms of prosecuting the case and where we came about. And ultimately, as we were barreling towards a preliminary hearing and towards trial, we were hit by, in 2020, in March of 2020, COVID. And that was a significant challenge that I talk about in the book, because I have witnesses, victims that are in their 60s, 70s, 80s. One of my witnesses was 93 years old, and I needed that witness to testify. And then one of the detectives down in Orange County was like 96 years old and was blind and near death and on his last leg. And so we had to get these witnesses in a courtroom to testify, and we were getting there. But then all of a sudden, everything shut down in March of 2020 because of COVID. And so that presented its own challenges that I talk about in the book, and how we came about making sure that he ended up getting 11 different consecutive life sentence, and then allowing all the victims, including the cases where the statute of limitation had run, for them to stand up in court and be able to give their impact statement, for them to be heard, and for DeAngelo, most importantly, to see them.
Yeah. So, did the case run that long that, the COVID scare was abated by then?
No, so it started, we were getting ready for the actual litigation, hearing proceeding in court when COVID hit. And then eventually what happened was, and we were seeking the death penalty, we decided to remove the death penalty from the table. And he ended up pleading to all the murders, all the rapes that we were charged, or the aggravated kidnapping, and to say, I admit to all of the crimes, whether we were able to charge it with the statute of limitation or not. And so now he's sitting in prison doing multiple life without the possibility of parole. And the victims were able to get their day in court and to be able to confront and see him.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And, congratulations, by the way, to you and everybody that was involved with that. It's just, how many thousands of total, officers and attorneys and lab people do you think were involved with putting all this together?
So discovery is the materials, the police reports, all the evidence that we have to discover, that we have to give over to the defense. We gave over nearly 3 million pages of discovery from 11 different counties, with 3 generations of police officers that continue to investigate the case over a 40-year time period. So you can imagine the volume of recordings, the volume of videos, photographs, forensic evidence, interviews, tips that came in, not just from us, but to the FBI. I mean, it was just a monster of a case, nothing that I've ever experienced in my life. And there were times that I was almost gripped with panic, and how am I going to deal with this? How am I going to be able to take all this in and organize it and get it out and retell the story in a coherent manner? But I can tell you that, oftentimes I would close my eyes and remind myself of that old saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? And I would also remind myself, take care of the things that I can control, and the things I can't control will take care of themselves, and that's all that you can do in life. But it was a ginormous task of monumental proportion by generations of police officers and prosecutors from 6 different counties.
So from the time that you had actually got the warrant, and the officers were able to go in and arrest him, from that moment until the trial date, how much time was that?
From the time that he was arrested to the time that we were at sentencing and he was sent to prison was almost 2 years.
Wow. So putting this whole case together, and then getting the defense obviously has a certain amount of time that they can receive all this information. And then I'm sure there were a lot of continuances. Were there any delays that you didn't expect initially?
Well, first of all, there were a lot of requests of continuances by the defense, and that's what I had to go in court and fight, because it was up to them. Time is on their side. Time is their friend, but time is my enemy, right? Because my witnesses are getting older. My witnesses have health issues. They are passing away, and I lose that evidence. And so their thing is they just want to keep delaying it and delaying and delaying, and I have to keep pushing it. And that's what I did, was keep pushing it until we got to the inflection point. But the biggest delay, the biggest thing that I could not have anticipated was a global pandemic that we had not seen for 100 years.
Yeah. Yeah. That, I think about the chaos that it created in my life. And then you think about, one of the most notorious serial killers in the history of the United States, and you're trying to get that to trial, and that hits. Wow. That's so. How much, when you think about COVID itself, how much time out of that 2 years, how much time do you think was added just because of COVID?
I think we ended up, his sentencing was in August of 2020. So we were still in the beginning of COVID. But it definitely affected the case. It had an impact on the case. And if you think about it, and I was going back, and as I was writing the book, I recall, and I put it in the book, at one point, Judge Bowman at one of the court proceedings says, all right, everybody, we are following strict COVID guidelines. Everybody who has entered the courtroom, their temperature has been checked, and everybody has to be masked. Do you remember that? I mean, going into places where your temperature was checked and you had to wear a mask. I know it's been, 5 years since COVID, now that we are in 2025, but it had a definite, impact. And at the time that we ended up going to court at the end, we had to do it in the Sac State Ballroom, the Sacramento State University Ballroom, because a courtroom wasn't big enough, because we had to have 6 feet worth of social distancing. Right. And so we had to group people by 6 feet apart. Because remember, social distancing, like the first time we heard that, it was in 2020. Like, what is that? Right. And so we had to group 200 people in a ballroom 6 feet apart. Right. And to hold the court proceedings. So that was, and I talk about that in the book, and kind of went through that.
Wow. Yeah. I never even thought about that. Well, and it's especially infuriating because that 6 foot, the social distancing thing was just completely fabricated, just absolutely made up by Dr. Burks back there in Washington, D.C. Just pulled that right out of her rear end. But that I guess there's no courtroom anywhere that could accommodate that.
There's no courtroom. There's no courtroom in the entire world that could accommodate over 200 people 6 foot apart. So we had to go through the makeshift process of doing it at the Sacramento State Ballroom. We had to take the most high-profile inmate, put him into a vehicle, and transport him off-site to a location elsewhere, where being followed by the SWAT team and drones. So I detail all of that in the book as well.
Mr. Ho, I appreciate you coming on, and it's absolutely fascinating. Again, the book is The People versus Golden State Killer. And we will have everything that we need to, a link to your website so people can pre-order that. Thank you so much for coming on. And I can't wait to get my hands on this book and read all the details that you've put in there.
Well, thank you, Jared, for having me on your show. We'll send you an advanced copy of the book, but it comes out November 12th. It comes out November 11th, and you can get it on thienho.org. That's THINHO.org, and you can order it from a local bookstore. And I think people are going to enjoy the book and really get some insight into the prosecution of the Golden State Killer. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Your attention today brings us one step closer to exposing and eliminating the evil that brings crime to our communities. Hit subscribe and share this episode. Together, we will bring justice to every victim.